Shortly after dropping his provisions to the men, Adrian Marks's commanding officer, George Atterbury, arrives on the scene. Marks gives Atterbury the same tour of the men that he was given by Chuck Gwynn, and Chuck Gwynn heads back to base as he is low on fuel. As soon as the flyover is complete, Atterbury picks out the men that he's going to drop his rafts to and proceeds to do so. At this time in the water, the men are still being bothered by sharks. As soon as Chuck Gwynn had showed up, the men were lifeless when the plane showed up, and Chuck Gwynn ended up seeing them when he was at about 5,000 feet. One of the men saw him straight down there, so he brought the plane down to 300 feet to do a flyover the men, and was shocked because he was looking for oil. They thought they had an oil slick, and there's heads, oily heads all over in there. And he flaps his wings to let them know that he sees them, and the men come to life and start cheering and splashing and kicking. And that must be when 60 men were torn up on a floater net, and Chuck Gwynn must have saw that. And that's also when a man ended up having his leg sawed off. As Atterbury is finishing dropping his provisions, Adrian Marks notices that the men in the water individually without the rafts, they are being bothered by sharks. He's already heard about the floater net that got torn up in the matter of 15 minutes, and he is not going to let these men sit in the water and fend off sharks for another night. He decides he's going to make a landing. They're under standing orders not to do so. They've lost too many planes. Doesn't matter. He comes down just above the water, slows down to just before stall speed. And he's trying to time himself, 10-foot swells. He wants to hit the trough in between the two swells. So he's flying as slow as he can, as close to the water as he can. And as soon as he feels the timing's right, he cuts the power. The plane slams into the water. The boys that had witnessed the plane go down thought that it had crashed. They thought for sure that thing was going to crash and sink. And they were surprised to see when the swells moved away, the plane was still floating. Aboard the plane, there was some water coming in, rivets had been loosened, paneling loosened up, but the men were able to bail it out quickly. Adrian Marks started up the propeller, and he headed to the first survivors. He would pull up alongside of them, carefully going over the swells to get down on alongside the men, and two men would be at the doorway. They would grab onto the boy, because usually they had no energy to help themselves out of the water, and they would lift them up and onto the deck. They would give them 1 ounce of water, and usually they would vomit, and then they would pass out. They would fall into a deep sleep. So this was the start of a long process of rescuing people. As soon as Atterbury was done dropping his provisions, he became the eyes for Marks. So he would fly above and direct Marks where to go. They only had hours left of daylight, so they were working as fast as they can, but it was a slow process, as every time they had to stop to pick up the survivor, it took the propeller a long time to get the motion going again to get to the next man. One of the first people they ran into, Charles McKissick, Lieutenant Charles McKissick, who we last met, was swimming around in circles waiting to go down and get some water, and then a raft was dropped by him. He was sitting by the raft trying to figure out what it was, and when somebody told him to leave it alone, it was an airdrop. It was a government experimental airdrop for the mail, and he didn't want to go to jail, and he swam himself away. Now he's looking up and he sees a plane. He sees the plane on the water, he sees two men standing in there, and he sees that they're talking, he can't tell anything, and suddenly he starts hearing, "Grab it, grab it." He thinks to himself, "Grab what?" And he looks down in the water, and there's a life ring right in front of him with a rope tied that they had thrown to him. And he says to himself, "Why don't they just leave me alone?" And after they keep yelling, "Grab it," he says, "Fine, do what you want with me," grabs onto the ring, and they pull him up. Just like everybody else, they get him up and onto the plane. They give him 1 ounce of water. He retches that up, and he passes out into a deep sleep. This will continue throughout the day. Over in the Redmayne group this afternoon, Harlan Twibble now becomes too exhausted to be an effective leader, and Lieutenant Richard Redmayne's assistant, Chief Benton, he takes over the group, giving them orders, trying to keep them together, trying to keep them calm, because he knows the ships are on the way. He just needs to keep them together for the next few hours, and hopefully they'll be picked up. Late in the afternoon, in Dr. Haynes's group, there's a raft drop near the men. Dr. Haynes swims over to the raft, but like other men that have a raft with them, he is too exhausted to be able to pull the cord himself to have it inflate. The other men singled out there are also having problems. Some can get it open but can't get in because they're so exhausted, and others can't even pull the ripcord to open it up, but they're able to hang on to it as their life vests have them chin high in the water now. They were rated for 48 hours. We're 4 days into it. They're going into their 5th day. Any moment these things could fill up and fully saturate, and then they act like a lead weight. The thing that was keeping them up would take them down. Late in the afternoon, Adrian Marks's plane came across the Dr. Haynes group. Adrian Marks felt bad that he could not rescue any of those boys out of the water and put them on his plane, but he had to help the individual survivors that didn't have the comfort or the protection of multiple people with them. So he ended up giving Dr. Haynes, when he swam over, a quart of water. Dr. Haynes swam back to his raft. He climbed aboard his raft, took a cup and poured about 1 ounce of water into the cup, and he would overlook the boys around the raft. And he would point out and he would say, "You." And he would hand the cup to the boys, and these boys that didn't have water for 4 days took that cup and passed it back to whoever he said. None of them cheated through this whole process. Shortly after passing out all the water from the quart, men still needed water. He looks around his raft and he locates a device that will remove salt from seawater. He quickly reads the directions, he starts operating the device, and in about 10 minutes of not being able to get it to work, the man who watched his 2 best friends on the ship, and Father Conway and Stanley Lipsky, pass away, who gave the last rites to probably over 100 boys, broke down. He broke down crying. He could not take it. He took the device, threw it overboard, and cried. And night is falling. As day turns to night on the 4th day, Captain McVeigh and Giles McCoy's raft groups are both watching a bunch of plane activity off in the distance, miles away. They're never covered in the searches, and they're starting to worry that they're not going to be picked up. They've been pushed by the prevailing winds in one direction, while the tides have taken the swimmers in another direction, and the rafters have men in the water, men on floater nets, and men in rafts, and they drift a lot different than the swimmers and then the rafts. The rafts are drifting away from the swimmers are drifting away from the rafts, and in the middle is the Redmayne Twibble group. And this is going to go on throughout the night. They're going to be watching planes rescuing people, then they're going to watch the ships pull up and rescue people, but the planes still are not going to come near them. They're going to worry about this all night. Captain McVeigh has his boys grab onto an ammunition can. They put everything flammable they can inside of it. They light it on fire in the hopes that one of the planes that are out there right now can see them. But that fire goes out without any plane noticing them. Shortly thereafter, they're going to see ships pull up, and all they can do is sit and watch and wait for daylight to come, hoping somebody realizes they're still out there. As day turns to night, the men's hopes of being rescued are still very slim. They know the planes can't help them, and they don't see any ships. But shortly after it gets dark, the men looking off in the distance think they see a discolored cloud, like a pink cloud. And as the minutes pass, it gets stronger and stronger, and they can tell it is a searchlight from a ship. It is the USS Doyle, who, when Adrian Marks was flying over to go out at the very beginning of his trip, radioed down to the USS Doyle, and Claytor, the captain, decided he was going to, without orders, turn his ship and go to the same spot. Now he is about an hour off, and he has ordered one searchlight down into the water to search for survivors, the other one up at the top. He wanted that in the clouds. He wanted to give the boys hope. And when the boys were interviewed afterwards, many said that, you know, they looked in the clouds, and once they figured out that that was really a searchlight, it gave them so much hope and so much life. They could make it now. They knew they were going to be rescued. But it couldn't get past the fact that it's war. There's Japanese subs out there, and that's almost suicide for a ship. But they were happy that it was done. So shortly thereafter, the Doyle arrives on the scene, but the Doyle is homing in on the beacon of Adrian Marks's plane. So the Doyle heads straight to Adrian Marks's plane when it gets there. They launch a boat with a few men on it and get over to the plane, and one by one they take the survivors out of the plane. The men hand them the survivors to put into the ship. Now they got to do this all with their own power, which is very difficult and it's time consuming, so it takes them a long time to get the 56 men and then Marx's crew off of the plane, and they're going to spend the next few hours in this process. Shortly after then, maybe an hour or so later, the USS Bassett shows up. They show up from a different command. They're coming from a different area. There's two commands out there, Marianas and Pacific Command, and they run right into the Redmayne group. The Redmayne group ends up being the largest group of men in the water. They go ahead and pull up to a stop, put their boat into the water, a couple men in there with guns. The men are armed, and they pull up close to one of the rafts and they stop. And the men in the rafts can't see because these large lights are just, all they can see is lights, but they can hear, they can see the boat, the ship behind this boat, they can see the spotlights on them, so they're seeing lights and they're seeing silhouettes, and they can see that there's machine guns pointed at them, and they can hear them getting them ready to shoot. So the boat comes to a stop and they yell out, "Who are you?" Nobody still knows who's in the water, and they say, "We're Americans." And they say, "Who are you?" And they say, "From the Indianapolis." And that's still not enough because of all the games that the Japanese had been playing throughout the war with fake SOSs, with fake sinkings of ships. They asked, what city do the Dodgers play in? The Redmayne group is filled with men that are exhausted, tired, not in their right mind, just like other groups. Not as bad though, but luckily one of the men, he shouts out Brooklyn. All those men not in their right mind, and somebody that knew where it was the one that answered. Ship comes over and starts the tedious process of lifting the boys out of their rafts or out of the water into the boat. Then they got to get them back to their ship. Getting the boys up onto the ships, getting them up over to the rails. Some of the boys were pulled up, hanging on to the ropes. Some of the boys were hoisted up, and some of the men were able to climb up the ropes themselves and walk and then just go have a cup of coffee. Those were probably the men that had provisions, they had food, so they were probably in a lot better shape than those boys that were in the swimmer groups that had nothing. So some boys get up there and they hoist them over the side. One sailor grabs each arm and their feet drag behind them as they're taking them back to the shower rooms. The whole decks now are filled with oil and salt water mix, and it's hard for the healthy men to walk on this thing, but they're continually bringing these men over the ship and dragging them off into the showers, and this is how they get them onto both ships. Both of the ship's decks, probably every ship out there, the decks are just a slippery mess, but they got to work through it. They got to get these boys out of the water, and that's how they do so. Dr. Lewis Haynes, when he was finally brought aboard a ship, he was trying to tell the story as soon as he's crying and just talking, trying to tell the whole story as he's being led back to the showers. They quickly give him a shower, they give him his water, they offer him some food, and then they whisk him away into a room where they go ahead and they pick his brain on everything that went on, especially the medical situation, on the hypothermia, on the photophobia, on the phase shift that the lungs were going through when the salt spray would hit the kids. They would go through what they call a phase shift in the lungs, where it starts building up liquid and you'll end up with pneumonia. All these things, they got much of the information we have from the Indianapolis is from Dr. Lewis Haynes himself. Throughout the night, Giles McCoy and Charles McVeigh's group just end up watching all the activity off in the distance, worrying more and more. Daylight breaks, they're still not seeing. Hours go by, they're still not seeing. And finally, Captain McVeigh and his boys think they see a ship coming right at them, and they do. A ship is headed straight at them, and the ship's detecting equipment had picked up the ammunition can that they had made the fire in the night before for the plane to see that didn't see it, but now they're picked up by that. Head straight to the group, picks up the Captain McVeigh and his 9 boys, making them the second to last group out of the water. Shortly thereafter, a boat locates Giles McCoy's raft, and they become the last ones taken out of the water. Giles McCoy, Felton Outland, Ed Payne, Willis Gray, and Robert Brundage are the last ones taken out of the water. Now that all the survivors are on the ships, they are going to turn their attention to recovery. Throughout the night, A total of 6 ships arrive on the scene, including the Ringness. The Basset and the Doyle are already there. The Basset fills itself up with the survivors and just heads back to port to be able to get them medical attention. And the other 5 ships, once they get all the men on board, they start the recovery process. They're going to continue this throughout the next day, and then they're going to keep up a search in the air and the sea for days to come after that before it is all called off. But the recovery effort is underway. They locate a total of 90 plus bodies that are in the water floating. 60% of them have shark bites in them, so 4 in 10 of the 90 bodies that they had seen, so 36 or so bodies, had no shark bites at all, and they were in the water for 4 or 5 days, where these sharks are over attacking people that are alive. So it's hard to imagine, you know, how they just leave those bodies in there. The bodies were bloated, way past recognition, probably twice their size. They tried to, if they couldn't get a dog tag or they couldn't get any identification, if they had it, they would cut the fingertip skin off, and they would put that into a container, and they would take and moisten it up later and try to get fingerprints off of it to identify the men. But after they did that process, they took 3 5-inch shells, tied them to the bodies, and sank them to the bottom of the water until that process was finished. The ships that rescued the boys ended up taking them back to ports. Most of them went to Guam, others went to other ports that they had came out of, or something that's more available. And on the way, they were treated like kings by the boys on their ships. These boys were in tears seeing some of these men come over the ship, over the side of their ships. One boy had lost 35 pounds in 4 days. So they were in very bad shape, put some of the men in tears. The boys would take a sailor by the arms and take him on into the showers. And they had to use oil. This oil that they're covered in is so crude that they had to use oil to clean off the oil to be able to use soap and water. So they started out with a real light cleaner oil, and they cleaned the oil spots, avoiding every saltwater ulcer. They're not going to clean those spots. Those are going to be done by medical attention when they get to shore. So they clean up all the spots very carefully, getting rid of all the crude oil off of them with the lighter oil. And once that process is done, then they take soap and water and they clean the same areas, avoiding all the saltwater ulcers. Once that's done, they put them in clean pajamas and give them a cot. They offer them soups, hot soup, but the men weren't interested in hot soup. They also ordered, on one of the ships, they offered them orange wedges, and they loved the orange wedges. They couldn't get enough water. At first they were limited to little bits of amounts, but when they would get into the showers, they would lift their heads up and drink some of the water as much as they could. They got to their cots and they would just sleep. The Indy was able to be lost due to a perfect storm of circumstances, both with intel, with procedure, and with what that ship was itself. And we'll get into these real quick. On the intel, we had our Ultra program, and it was a decoding program. During the Battle of Midway, Admiral Nimitz had all the locations of the boats, submarines, anything that they had of Japanese, and they knew where everyone was. So it turned it into a pretty easy win in that battle for Nimitz. And shortly after that, the press in the United States ran a story that, you know, Nimitz had all the information, knew where everything was, and they had to change their Ultra program. Now captains were no longer in the loop. They could not get that directly. They had somebody much higher up in the chain was the one who would get the information, and when they got their routing orders, they were supposed to get the intel in there. It's supposed to be changed in its wording, and even the person giving the intel doesn't know where it came from. And the United States was letting Japanese ships and submarines go on their way at times, simply for the sole purpose to not let them know for sure that we still have this program going on. A change in procedure was that in Leyte, where it was the front of the war now, the Marianas were now in the back country, and the front was now in the Philippines, right near Japan. So in Leyte, they were receiving thousands of ships a day, and at the docks there was a man that would report. His duty was report arrivals. Well, there were so many ships coming in, they changed it and said do not report arrivals. That's going to become a slight issue. And then there's another issue to where there's a chop line between the two commands. The 7th Fleet, General MacArthur, he wanted the whole Navy under the Army's control. He wanted to make it one unit, and he was being fought off by Nimitz, who wanted to keep the Navy separate. Nimitz ended up winning it. They divided the command over there between Nimitz and MacArthur, and the Marianas over in Guam, that's MacArthur's area. Nimitz has the Pacific, he's got Leyte, and he's got Japan in his command. Now, before you get to the chop line, so they left the Marianas. The Marianas command is in charge of their protection and their well-being until they hit the chop line, and then it goes over to the Pacific command. So they both have on their boards the orders of where they're going. There's an arrival board over in Leyte where they'll erase the name eventually. Two other things that contributed to the Indy being able to be lost. One of them is the Japanese and their false flags. They were putting out false SOSs, like it was from our ships. They would put out chatter to their command and report that we sunk a destroyer, we sunk a battleship, in the hopes of bringing a ship out so that they could ambush it when it comes. And the other issue was who the Indy was herself. A special ship. She always had been since her commissioning in 1932. President Roosevelt used to travel around on her quite often, and she was one of the fastest ships we had at the time. She was also the flagship of the 5th Fleet and Admiral Spruance's ship. So anytime Admiral Spruance is on the ship, Captain McVeigh's orders are subordinate to Admiral Spruance, and the ship is often called off from whatever mission it's on to another mission, and nobody notifies the command of where they were due prior. So the ship can end up not showing up, and they could just wipe their name off the board, just assuming it got called off somewhere else. A couple days after the men were picked up out of the water, the Enola Gay lifts off the airstrip on Tinian Island and heads toward the city of Hiroshima. On board is the bomb with the component from the 5x5 by 15 foot crate. That was the firing mechanism, and they have half of what was in the cylinder in Captain McVeigh's cabin, which is the uranium in this bomb. And they get it over there and they drop the first bomb. The first atomic bomb ever used in war is on August 6th of 1945. After waiting to see if they would get an unconditional surrender, they do not. And a few days later, another plane flies over Nagasaki and it drops another bomb. And finally, they get the unconditional surrender, and they allow the emperor to stay in power, but they force him to have to take a photo with General MacArthur, which proves to their people that he's not a deity, he's not a god. The American public finally finds out about the Indianapolis disaster the day they're told that the war is over. When it's announced to the world that the war is over, the Navy releases the information that Indianapolis had been sunk, and shortly thereafter that there's going to be a court-martial against Captain McVeigh. They don't know what charges. Secretary Forrestal works till 2 days before the court-martial he's going to hold. He still has no clue which charges he's going to go with. He's got a list of 14 of them, trying to figure out which ones he can get to stick, and they have to narrow it down to just 2 they think is possible. One is endangering the ship by failure to zigzag, and the second is failure to abandon ship fast enough, failure to give the order to abandon ship soon enough. So while they were out to court-martial people that were abandoning ship too soon, they're now court-martialing Captain McVeigh on the very opposite thing. They finally get to the court-martial, and it begins. One of the earliest people that go ahead and testify is Dr. Lewis Haynes. He's asked about what happened, and Dr. Lewis Haynes starts out and tells him, well, about 20 men had died the first couple of hours, and he's cut off. Not even able to finish his sentence. He's cut off, and he is told that we don't want to hear anything about when you ended up in the water. We want to know about how you ended up in the water. So right there, the Navy made it so that nobody was going to hear what happened and how that Navy left those men in the water. All they wanted to know was how that ship ended up in the water, so that nobody outside of Captain McVeigh basically is going to get any punishment in this. A few do, but it's just a reprimand and it's withdrawn later. So they cut off Dr. Haynes. Dr. Haynes goes ahead, answers their questions. Defense gets up, and one of the last questions to ask just about all the survivors is, would you serve under Captain McVeigh again? And to a man, everyone said yes, that he ran a great ship, that he was a great captain. So they would all serve with him again. And one by one, the men get up there, they answer the questions they have, go through the defense questions, and then they get near the end of the trial, and the U.S. government is calling a surprise witness. They're flying in Commander Hashimoto himself, who sunk the ship. And Commander Hashimoto's wife is worried because, you know, he sunk their ship. He's going to America. She's worried about his safety now. Hashimoto arrives. We give him a hotel room. We fly him in, give him a hotel room, put a guard on him, not to keep him in there. He's not like prisoner or anything. They just want to make sure nobody gets to him, tries to do anything to him. So they put guards with him, and then he's able to testify. He gets up there to testify, and we get to the zigzagging. He's asked if that ship was zigzagging, if it would have mattered. He said no, it wouldn't have mattered. He says, as a matter of fact, the fact the ship wasn't zigzagging was more confusing to him. Other people that have sunk the most tonnage in the U.S. side testified that, you know, if a ship is zigzagging, the only way it's as effective is if you somehow can zag at the right time for the torpedo to go by. Other than that, it's pretty easy to sink a ship. He didn't have any problem sinking ships that were zigzagging. Hashimoto finishes up his testimony, and shortly thereafter, the defense and the prosecution rest their case, and they're going to come back with a verdict pretty soon. Court-martial's finished. Captain McVeigh, he ends up getting guilty on failure to zigzag, but not guilty on failure to give timely abandoned ship order. So guilty, not guilty. He gets permanent rank demotion, he gets temporary rank demotion, and he spends the rest of his time in the Navy in a desk job. Court-martial finished, the men recovered. It's time for some to stay on and many of them to leave. Leaving is Lieutenant Richard Redmayne. He is up for promotion. He was being groomed to be supervisor of the watch when they got torpedoed, and even though he's up for his promotion and it's basically his, he leaves. Another one that leaves is Harlan Twibble. He leaves and goes into the private sector and becomes a successful businessman. Another leaves is Giles McCoy of the Marines. He leaves also. He quickly develops back problems, and he goes and sees a chiropractor. He's so happy with what they did and how he feels after he goes to see the chiropractor that he immediately goes to school and opens up a practice of his own, and that's what he does for the rest of his life. Otha Havens was in Captain McVeigh's group of 10 men. He was on one of the rafts, and he is a very religious man. A couple days before they were rescued, he had told God that he would serve him, he would go to work for him if he would just save him and his friends. And that happened, and he was true to his word. He left the Navy and went to work for God, joined the church. Many stayed for a short time and left, but most of them seem to have moved on. Some of them went into private life and struggled, you know, with alcohol and with the memories of what had happened. They were scarred for life, all of them, but some of them couldn't deal with it. Many of them could, though. Bob Gauss became a very successful businessman in Florida, and he also started a side hobby of going out and catching great white sharks. So I think all sharks. He became a pretty well-known shark hunter down here in Florida for a time, and that's what he ended up doing. Dr. Lewis Haynes had his own post-traumatic stress disorder. He could never go to church after that. He had said the Lord's Prayer so much that every time he hears it or says it, he comes to tears. It brings it all back to him, all the boys that he had to say that for before he let them go into the water's depths to their graves. So there was quite a bit of post-traumatic stress. Many of the survivors never spoke of this for years, some for 13 years until the first reunion. So that's the conclusion of the men in the water and of their little background of what they had to go through. And then you get into Captain McVeigh, him and his wife. He's getting letters now from the court-martial forward, from the family members that have lost family members on the ship. You know, they're not good letters, and they bring him to tears, so much so that his wife starts to get the mail before him and take those letters out. So his first wife is taking all the nasty letters from the survivors' families out, so Captain McVeigh doesn't have to go through this. Captain McVeigh, he stayed on a desk job until he retired years later. His life after the war, like many others, was never the same. You had 18-year-old boys that were now men. They were men when they got back. The things that kids their age wanted to do no longer interested them. They wanted to just get out there and get their life started and start living their life, get their career going. They had no time for games anymore. These boys, in 4 days in the water, some of them 4.5 days in the water, it changed their whole life. It made them grow up years in those 4 days. The years start to pass. Captain McVeigh is trying to move on with his life. He retires years after he ends up in the desk job after the sinking. Him and his wife try to have a normal life. The boys have moved on with their lives. Some of them have stayed in the Navy. Most of them have moved on. And things are starting to come to light. There's some authors out there that are working on Captain McVeigh's behalf to try to get the information on what happened. And one of the documents they're able to procure shows that the Navy knows that 3 SOSs got off that ship. One went to a headquarters where they deciphered it and took it up to the man in charge. He was sleeping at the time. He woke up. They told him the message. He said, "Wake me if they get another one," and he went back to sleep. Another one that received it was a ship, and they tried to forward that SOS to others. And then the third one was Gillette's command, and Gillette was off playing bridge with probably other captains, other higher-ups in the brass, and he was not at his base when the message came in. They deciphered the message, and then they quickly dispatched 2 tugs. They sent 2 ocean-going tugs to that location. The problem is Gillette returned to base about 7 hours after that SOS was received. He found out that they had sent the 2 tugs out, and while the 2 tugs were 7 hours into the 21-hour trip to get to where the men were, he ordered them to come back. Again, you know, it's all the false flags and all the fake SOSs, fake sinkings of ships. None of these captains believe any of these unless they're getting unless they're receiving multiple SOSs. But that ship went down so fast they couldn't get off that many. But from the time the torpedo hit to the time they sunk, 12 minutes. As the years pass, the boys are trying to get over some mental and physical wounds that are still with them. Mentally, there's one boy that can't go for walks very far. He has to stop and knock on strangers' doors and ask them if he could have a glass of water. Dr. Lewis Haynes can no longer go into church. He can't go to church, he can't say the Lord's Prayer, and he can't hear the Lord's Prayer because all the boys he said it for when he was letting them go to their watery graves. Physical, they had to get over months and years of skin issues from the saltwater ulcers, and some had more complicated surgeries further down the line that they didn't even know about that happened because of all lifting the legs to avoid the sharks, and it ended up overworking the muscles when the body was probably taken from the muscles to be able to sustain the man in the first place. So they're going through all this, and late in 1958, Giles McCoy, he gets a knock on his door, and he's surprised to see Felton Outland, one of his 5 members in his raft, is at his door. Steps out onto the porch, they look at each other for a second, they fall in an embracing hug and start to weep. They spend the next 2 days at Giles McCoy's house sharing memories, crying, laughing, just sharing experience that not many people other than the people on that ship experienced. And finally, the 2 days are up. Felton Outland says his goodbyes and goes on his way. Giles McCoy knows he feels a lot better now that he's talked about it. He doesn't talk about the incident much at all. And he gets it into his head that it'd be a good thing to get all the survivors together and do the same thing. So now Giles McCoy grabs onto the book, Abandoned Ship, which has the list of all the survivors from the Indianapolis in it. And one by one, he starts to contact everyone he can. He gets very, very good response from most of the men. There is a minority that has moved on. They're mad at him for even bringing it up. They're kind of not the nicest to him in the letters. They don't want anything to do with it. But he's able to get 220 men of the 316 survivors to agree to get together in 1960 for the Indianapolis reunion. And two of the people that are invited, one is Wilbur Chuck Gwynn. He is the pilot that his plane ended up spotting the oil slick, came down and discovered the men. He ended up being invited to every 5-year reunion from 1960 on. He was their angel, and they weren't going to not invite him. The other that was going to be in attendance at the first reunion in 1960 was Captain Charles B. McVeigh. He's now retired and living with his wife, his first wife. And he is on a plane on his way to the reunion, and he is nervous. He has been receiving letters, heavy at first until his wife started hiding them on him, from families blaming him solely for the loss of that ship and the loss of their loved ones. So he's worried in the back of his mind, do some of my boys think this of me too? Plane pulls up. Captain McVeigh enters into the terminal, and he is stunned to see 220 of his boys lined up on both sides, saluting. And he salutes back, and the boys fall in, and they're cheering, and they're trying to get around him. One of the boys he sees is Giles McCoy, and they shake hands. He tells them he loves them. Most of these boys haven't seen him since they testified in the court-martial 13 years earlier, and they're glad to see their captain again. One of the boys shouts out, "You got railroaded," and Captain McVeigh stops seriously for a second, thinks about it, and says, "No, I got what I deserved." And they move on and move into the convention center and into the hotel, spending the whole weekend together in the convention center, telling stories, laughing, crying, just sharing, emptying their souls about this experience. They left, and every 5 years from then on, the survivors would get together. A few years after the 1960 reunion, Captain McVeigh's wife, his first wife, she gets ill and she passes away pretty quickly, and he very quickly remarries to somebody he knew back in the past right afterwards. But she did not know that he was getting these letters and to hide them, and all of a sudden the letters started coming straight to Captain McVeigh again. So on a winter day, 1968, I think it was in November, Captain McVeigh walks outside his door onto his porch, down onto the walk to the porch. He lies himself down with his dog running around next to him and shoots himself in the head. He is now still the only one blamed for the sinking of the Indianapolis, and all the families that had lost loved ones had let him know that it was his fault, and he just couldn't deal with that any longer and ended his life. After Captain McVeigh took his life, and even before, some of his men were working hard to clear his name. Well, they really went hard to clear his name now. Many of the authors of the books on the Indianapolis also helped with this. And finally, in 1999, over 50 years after the torpedoing of that ship, bill goes through to exonerate Captain McVeigh of wrongdoing, to get rid of the court-martial. It is signed by Bill Clinton in 2000, and in 2001, the Secretary of the Navy expunged Captain McVeigh's record of any wrongdoing in the incident. So his name is cleared. Sometimes they say better late than never. I guess it is, but I mean, how much better is it? With Captain McVeigh's name finally cleared, the men can enjoy their reunions a little bit more and not have to worry about their captain being blamed for the ship going down. They have their reunions every 5 years up until present. The numbers are whittled down, of course, as members pass away. In 2021, the last remaining Marine of the 39 Marine detail that was on board and the 9 that survived the sinking, Edgar Harrell, passed away. He was 96 years old. That leaves 2 remaining. So there's 2 survivors of the Indianapolis still alive, Cletus LeBeau and Harold Bray Jr. And these men are in their 90s. Most of the men that passed away in the last 10 years lived healthy, long lives till their 90s, and there's nobody that deserved it more. An hour after the torpedoing of the Indianapolis, Commander Hashimoto had ordered his sub to surface. He searched the area for an hour and a half without being able to see anything. He thought it prudent to get out of the area then because he assumed ships would be coming to rescue them. Then he headed off. He was going to head back to Japan, but on the way he was going to try to sink another convoy. He's running low on fuel, but he has enough to try to sink another ship on his way back to Japan, and that's exactly what he's going to do. On his way back to Japan, he sunk them on Sunday night, which is Monday morning. On Thursday and Friday of the next week, he starts hearing chatter from the United States side that he knows that a ship sunk, but he doubts that it's the ship that he had shot. He's been waiting to hear this chatter and he has heard nothing. And when he finally hears it, it's so many days past, he can't believe that that would be the ship that he had shot. He can't believe Americans were kept in the water for 5 days. So he takes and he makes one last, he fires a Caton, which is a man-torpedo, at a small U.S. convoy, and that is the last time that a U.S. ship was fired upon by the Japanese. Shortly thereafter, after the war had ended, he arrives back at his port. As he arrives on port, he's handed orders that tell him to cease and desist hostilities. The war is over.